Thank you for calling in. David, thank you for joining us. I know this is going to be an absolutely amazing conversation because I've known you for many years and you're the person or one of the people that I call when I need more information about Europe and geopolitics in general. I want to start by thanking everyone for calling in. Thank you to our Omnia clients for calling in. And we have a lot of ELNET board members, supporters who have called in. Thank you. I think you already know that David is a superstar. I think you already know that as a supporter of ELNET, you're getting no better return on investment in philanthropy. They do amazing work. I'm very happy to support them personally, Rachel and myself, and we're very glad that you're here to join us for this very important conversation. So David, you're a former diplomat. If I were to read your bio, it would be too long to read it at the beginning, and I want to focus on the discussion. But Consul General to the Southwest of the United States, you worked in the United Nations. You're really an expert when it comes to Europe, Israel, the United States. You've been in conversations with state leaders from regions around the world and been in very detailed, in-depth negotiations and policy discussions. And I know from Omnia's perspective, as a family office, whenever we think about investments, we always think about risk. And it's very important for us to have conversations about geopolitics, a better understanding, and frankly, for us to have a friend like you and an amazing organization like ELNET that gives us an opportunity to learn so much more about what's going on in the world, whether it be a Russia-Ukraine war, supply chains, or energy flows, or what's going on with Iran. You, as you know, David, actually, unfortunately for you, you were on my short list of people that I call every morning to get an update. So appreciate you being here. We're going to start sort of around 50,000 feet and then get into a little bit more detail. For those who are on the live, we are going to probably speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. I know that a bunch of you have already submitted questions, both in email and to my cell phone, as is par for the course. For those who have not yet, if you would like to submit a question, please do it in the question/chat box at the bottom. I will do what I can to make sure every question is answered appropriately. And also for those who want to follow up with David at elnetus.org or want to follow up with me afterwards, we'll be recording this and sending you a follow-up with follow-up information. So ready to get going. David, you ready?
I am. Thank you for having me, Lawrence. Great to be here.
My So I want to start, as I said, I want to start sort of at 50,000 feet. From your perspective, you could look at, again, Russia, Ukraine, what's going on, with Iran and Israel, the Eastern Med. We were just talking earlier about liquid natural gas and other energy flows in Cyprus and Azerbaijan. How much has the global system changed, in your opinion?
Well, it's again, thank you. And thank you everyone for being here. I'll try to be brief. I think everyone understands that the world has changed very significantly, certainly since COVID. The awareness of the downside of globalization, the vulnerability that countries face in terms of supply lines. Add to that, obviously the war in Ukraine in 2022 that accelerated the process even further. Then the tariff situation last year in 2025, and of course the war now that is accelerating things. So absolutely, you're seeing more regionalization, more. The trade levels haven't really changed. I understand in comparison to GDP. So the overall trade is the same, but the composition of the trade has totally changed. So nations trade with their allies. And certainly that's the case, with the United States, certainly Israel. So that, the cost of that is redundancy and lack of efficiency, but the upside is much more security in your supply lines and what nations need for their security,
Yeah. I
economic
want to
security.
Yeah, thanks, David. I want to double down on that question before getting into Europe specifically. I mean, I think one of the things that, you and I speak about all the time, and I know we speak about it on our investment team at Omnia, is you can't separate geopolitics from economics, right? And there's always downstream effects to these conflicts or, having to change supply routes, having access to, for example, rare earth elements and magnets for our military and for, the future of AI, having enough energy to power the future of AI. And I want to talk about Europe in a second, specifically about the important role that they play. But from your conversations with decision makers across Europe, let's start specifically, because ELNET has offices all across Europe, working with the highest levels of government, and obviously your relationship with the Israelis. What are they speaking about in terms of finance and global economics as it relates to security?
So obviously Europe has had a very rude awakening that really should have started earlier in 2014 and even 2008 when the Russians began, encroaching on various borders in Europe from Georgia to Ukraine and then the big war in 2022. So the Europeans are certainly waking up to that reality that they need to secure their supply lines, their energy sources. They moved away from Russia as a result of the war with Ukraine and then relied more and more on the Gulf. And now that choke point is affecting them very significantly, certainly in terms of gas and energy. Their storage levels are low. They're going to have to catch up for the coming winter. The U.S. will gain from that and other suppliers. That could be the Eastern Med countries and certainly Azerbaijan, which is close proximity to Europe. But sure, it's having a very significant effect on them. Not to mention, the defense rearmament, remanufacturing, and everything that the European countries are going through right now.
Yeah. So let's boil down to Europe a little bit. And look, I am one of the people, because most of my family or a lot of my family lives in Europe, lives in France. And people who grew up there, like my wife, or people who live there, or people who think they know about Europe have this tendency to paint Europe with one big brush, as if all European countries are the same, as if Eastern Europe is the same as Western Europe, as the EU all agrees on everything. So I say this, David, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in America about Europe. And maybe if you could highlight some of the things that, based on your experience working throughout European capitals, what don't we get?
So I think that's the main point. There is no such thing as one Europe. There simply isn't. There is the Eastern Mediterranean countries, Greece, Cyprus, sometimes Italy, France, that are on the shores of the Mediterranean. They share that strategic environment with Israel. Several of those countries are threatened by Turkey and have forged alliances together, namely Cyprus, Greece, and Israel, which is a very, very significant, coalition or a sub-coalition of European countries that behave completely different than what you would expect. The Greek military special forces, the Israeli special forces trained together, the air forces trained together. Cyprus now was hit directly by Iran, not for the first time because they were hit by Libya several years ago as well. So they're very aware of the threat of national security to their economy, to tourism, to their own future. So that's one group of countries. Obviously, Central and Eastern Europe, which is a vast, it's a third of Europe. And if you include Ukraine in that, it's even more significant. It's around 10 countries, large and small. Poland may be the largest, with a huge defense budget and growing and very dependent on the United States in terms of its economic and defense relationships. But those countries are frontline countries with Russia. They are experiencing an existential threat, and it's not just for the first time. They emerged from Soviet occupation, and here it is again. Whether it's immediate or not, it also depends on how the war in Ukraine goes. And, the Russians aren't doing as bad as you may, as it appears in the media. Actually, the Russians are moving forward and Ukraine is fighting hard. So, those countries are with a completely different mindset. And that also drives them closer to Israel, both the fact that they're new democracies emerging out of Soviet occupation just, a few years ago, and the fact that they face these critical threats right now, and they connect it to Iran as well, because the Iranians are supplying the Russians with the drones that are killing Europeans, which should concern all of us because those drones are being spread everywhere. So you have different countries, and you'll hear other European leaders that will tell you they simply don't have enemies, even right now. they simply don't have enemies, really? Well, that's sort of the way they see the world because they see themselves as protected. If it's not Ukraine, then it will be Germany. If it's not Germany, then, the next in line. But they're further away from the front lines, and that, affects systems psychologically and collectively.
Yeah. I want to stamp this point, David, which you just made very eloquently, but I think it's worth mentioning again. And I don't want to get into politics. We call balls and strikes, both of us. But anyone who does not believe that the transatlantic alliance is extremely important, not only for the United States, but for Europe, for Western civilization, for our economy, for our supply chains, um, one can argue does not know what they're talking about. So, obviously, it's fair to say there's been some strain right now between the United States and certain European countries. We're seeing in Italy, obviously in Britain and France. But I want us to sort of see the what is the expression, see the tree beyond the leaves. Like, talk to us a little bit about the importance strategically of that transatlantic alliance. I mean, one of the things I learned, I moved to DC after 9/11 to fight the war on terror. For many, many years, we thought that these oceans were going to protect us. And we realized that in a global world, our adversaries are much closer to us, and we need to have allies. And it seems to me that Europe is our most natural set of allies.
I think there's no doubt about that, Lawrence, and thank you for asking that question. Look, the politics right now are high friction, but the reality is that Europe is really the largest democratic and economic bloc in the world. Rival, more or less in parallel to the United States in its economic power, or China, depending on the day you look at or the numbers you look at. But it's a huge community of countries. Now, when it comes to Israel, little Israel. Um, Europe is Israel's largest trading partner. And we have to remember that because, economics and defense are not distinct anymore, certainly not in the world today. I mean, if you are not economically, capable, you're not going to be militarily capable and vice versa. So Israel very much depends on Europe. So does the United States when you come down to it. It's a huge economic bloc. It's not the sense of today's White House politics at all, as you mentioned, and the tensions are very high. And in fact, you could even make the argument that some on the American side would want to see the Europeans suffer now, economically and otherwise. So, is Trump really that concerned about the energy, crunch in Europe? Probably not. But that, in the larger scheme of things, Europe is tremendously important, both as a trade bloc, as a community of democratic countries, some braver, some less so. But as a collective, it's a tremendously important part of the West that we at ELNET, seek to maintain and nurture and build relations with over time because it's going to always be there. It's always going to be on the doorstep of the Middle East. And as I mentioned before, there are countries there that are maybe some of the most friendly to Israel and the United States in the world today that we should pay attention to, even though they may not be the largest or the most well-known ones.
Yeah. In a second, David, I want to speak about ELNET's incredible work on the ground, but you brought up an issue which I was going to ask you later, but I think it's a natural segue right now, is about energy. I mean, we're having this, well, it's not, it's in between a Cold War and a hot war now with Iran, and there's debates, as we discussed earlier, about how long the Iranians can hold out before they collapse. Some saying 3 to 4 weeks, your assessment, 3 to 4 months, but it's not really my question. A big sticking point right now is the Strait of Hormuz, right? And Europe historically, let me ask you instead of telling you, is it true that Europe historically has gotten a lot of their energy, their natural gas and oil through the Strait of Hormuz? Are they feeling this energy crunch? I mean, and where else can they get energy from allied countries? And I say this because, I was having conversations with Bloomberg the other day, and you know, we're in an environment right now where certain tweets or social media messages are moving markets, which are not always tied to the fundamentals. I mean, there's enough supply to go around. There may be blips along the road, but there's enough for allied countries. So I thought maybe if you could weigh in on both of those issues before we speak about ELNET specifically.
So no, that's really important conversation, Lawrence. I think the number one issue to be aware of today is like, the what is it? the founder of NVIDIA said that 90% of all information is going to be synthetically manufactured very soon. Okay. But even before that, 90% of the information that we read is politically, economically driven by self-interest of the people putting it out. So I've learned, I would say the hard way, that not everything we read is real and not everything we read is accurate when we look at the news, certainly when we look at economic spin. And much of the discussion about the Strait of Hormuz is intended to put political pressure on the White House to end the war. It's just simply a fact in the West, in the overall West. You're absolutely right. Where if you look at the evidence, look at the price of oil, yes, it is up, but it is nowhere as high as it was during the Ukraine war in 2022, and it's nowhere meeting the expectations or the alarmism that we saw. We're well into the second month of this war, if I'm not mistaken, and the oil prices are fairly stable, and so are the markets. So the blip on the U.S. Stock market has not been that significant. The economic damage in the world, if you look at the IMF figures and so on, it's really a blip. I mean, I don't want to downplay it too much, but it's 1/10 of COVID, and the Ukraine war. It's so and you have to judge things almost day by day. I mean, yes, it is true that maybe some of the supplies will start running out and the price of oil will start hitting higher highs, but at this point, it's actually fairly stable. Now, Europe is dependent, although not as much as it seems. I think the numbers are 8% for crude, and yes, it does affect jet fuel and diesel and certain pockets of the economy. Their LNG gas, 45% of it came from Qatar, if I'm not mistaken with my numbers. But again, as you mentioned, there are replacements, there are substitutes. The United States is a huge LNG exporter and did the same in 2022 after the war in Ukraine when the Europeans delinked from Russian energy. And countries like Azerbaijan are right there again, and the Eastern Med countries that will do their share. It won't cover all of Europe, but there are sources that Europe has, and Europe doesn't have a lack of finances,
Right.
as you can see when you go to Paris.
Correct.
So.
Correct. Correct. So yeah, just to remind folks, and I'm seeing some questions coming into the Q&A chat box, and people are still using my cell phone as a Q&A chat box. So feel free to send them at either place, and I'll make sure we answer your questions. But I want to get down to some of the work that you and your colleagues do at ELNET, work that I think is groundbreaking, I think is highly impactful, and I think is so important. And I actually think this is my personal opinion that it's more important now than ever, especially when there's so many frictures or fissures in the European American, European Israeli relationship. I think having folks like you on the ground is so important today. So before getting into, I want to ask you, like, what is the importance? So you mentioned, Europe is the largest trade partner for Israel. But what is the ultimate importance of the European-Israeli relationship, and why is it so important that it's not only salvaged, but it grows and strengthens over time?
So thank you, Lawrence. Great question. So look, Europe is both absolutely vital to the future existence of the state of Israel and totally unpredictable because just in the EU itself, you have 27 countries. That doesn't include the UK, and you can go beyond the EU into other countries in Europe, and there are something like 40 to 50 countries. They all have their own politics, their own election cycles. Left-wing governments can be voted in, right-wing governments can be voted in. There is the rise of the populist right, of course, and in some countries is palatable, in other countries is not. And we can get into that, but by and large, Europe is vital to Israel and unpredictable, which means that you need a network there to build relations with leaders, thought leaders, policymakers that is deeper than political cycles, that is more long lasting than those political cycles, if you believe that those relationships are vital for you. And in Israel's case, certainly, I'm not going to even mention what's happening in America right now, and just look at the polls and look at the polls of younger younger demographics, and you know yourself how significant the challenges are in this country that Israel will be facing, and not just Israel, but Israel for the sake of this conversation. That as investors, it's probably the unwisest thing is to put all of your wagers and all of your life savings on one stock. We all know that. So even though the United States is the most important partner that Israel has in the world and has had for several decades, Europe is right there. It's adjacent to Israel. We talked about countries being further away and closer by, with shared values, shared history, sometimes negative, obviously, but that negativity actually helps solidify relations in the present and the future. So it's absolutely vital. Without Europe, Israel has really little trade. Without Europe, Israel's defense exports would be much lower. In fact, Europe is the highest region in the world for Israeli defense exports now. And of course, we're in an age of national security, and that revenue comes back, and we can talk about how significant that is. But without Europe, there's no Israeli science, because most of the funding for innovation and research institutes is coming from European public funding. So we need to make sure that those that make the decisions in Europe about whether Israel will be included in those programs or not are engaged, and not on the day they need to make their decision, but many, many years before, and to have relations of trust that they can fall back on and relate to as human to human, and understanding more or less what's happening in the Middle East, and not just on that social media that we just talked about, when 90% of the time it's completely false.
Sure. Thank you. I have a two-part question. And I want you to talk a little bit about the structure, because I mentioned earlier, ELNET has offices all over Europe. But I think one of the things that was so impressive to me when I met you and I met the team at ELNET, and why the relationship with Omnia and ELNET is so important is, we're investors in our office, right? And we need to better understand the world and talk to the smartest people to make wise decisions. And I realized that a lot of people say they have access, but they lie. They don't. You guys really do have access. I mean, you are really sitting with the top leaders and capitals across Europe, sometimes agreeing with them and sometimes pushing back on them. So, talk a little bit about the structure of ELNET, the team that you have on the ground, and talk a little bit about, what does real access look like? And like day to day, what is your team trying to do?
Right, great question. So ELNET is really unique. It's not your typical, nonprofit. The vision of our founders, and I think Larry Hochberg is on the Zoom right now, so it's great to have him with us. 17, 18 years ago was that, again, we can't put all our eggs in one basket. We have to develop relations with this important continent, and we set out to create a network, not a hierarchy, a network. So we have 6 full-time offices in Europe, in France, in Germany, and the UK, and Italy, and Eastern Europe, in Brussels to engage NATO and the EU. And each one of those offices is registered as a European nonprofit with a European board. We obviously have representatives on all the boards so that we can keep it all together here from the United States, but it is genuinely a pro-Israel Europe movement that was built in Europe. Our offices are led by either former politicians. For example, our director in London came out of the Labour Party. She was a member of the Labour Party for 41 years. She was a member of parliament for 17 years. She was a minister in 2 Tony Blair governments, and she's the director of our office in the UK. So when she relates to a government, even if that government is difficult, and Starmer's government is difficult in its relationship both with the United States and Israel, she's an insider. She's known these people for 40 years. So she has access that no Israeli diplomat will have in her country. Same in Germany. We have, people that came out of the CDU, that came out of the political parties that are engaging their colleagues as insiders. And when you're in the room, the world is very different. When you're in the room, you realize what they really think about themselves, about the superpowers, about the future of Europe, about the relationship with Israel. And I
And the
think
relationship with the United States.
and relationship with the United States, their real anxieties, what really can be done, what can't be done. And you're able to put together a much more, and by the way, I need to do this every day because the world is so confusing and everything is in motion and nothing is certain. Even if you're the best intelligence agency in the world, you cannot tell me right now who's calling the shots in Iran. You can't. And you can't tell me how much storage they have and what their real capacity is, in this economic war vis-a-vis the U.S. Government. You just can't. So, having that inside information is critical, and it helps us put together, build our strategy through our offices in Europe, through their conversations with very, when we're successful, you're talking to the highest level people. And I mean the heads of intelligence agencies. I mean the head of security agencies. When you really understand what's happening in their countries, what exactly the Islamist threat is, how are they handling it? Are they aware of it? What are they doing about it? What are they doing about Russia? What are they thinking about Iran, really? Why aren't they part of this war when it really is their war? It is their war in so many ways. It is probably the most their war than any war out there, if you think about it, because Iran helped, inflame the Syrian civil war, which sent millions of Middle Easterners to Europe, which overturned their politics. And now Iran is participating in the war with Russia on Ukraine. There is no more war that is European after Ukraine, of course, than the war in Iran. It affects them directly. So what do they really think is important for us to know, and we build our strategy of engagement around that. Who are we going to bring to Israel? What delegations? What committees in their parliaments? Who really matters? A lot of people are there and make noise and don't matter.
Yeah.
There are very few that do, and our goal is to find them and engage them.
So David, I'm going to take the liberty of putting you on the spot because when you were a diplomat, you would never answer these questions, or you would answer them very eloquently, but in a very diplomatic way. But now, and that means now you're not.
Are we
Um,
off the record?
no, well, I probably should have said that at the beginning. But no, we're not off the record because we're recording
It's
this, so
okay.
we're going to send it out to a bunch of people. Um, but look, I'll tell you just, I'm very excited, obviously, you're bringing me to Italy, in Rome, in a few weeks and introducing me to a lot of decision makers around Europe and moderate Arab countries. And we don't have to get into that program specifically, but I just thank you again for being such a resource to me and to our team at Omnia. But where I'm putting you on the spot is, you know, what are we not hearing in open source that is important as investors that you may be hearing in conversations with a bunch of government officials? And you could pick a few examples. Obviously, you're in hundreds of conversations. I don't want you to divulge anything that you shouldn't. But are there any themes that we should be thinking about that maybe aren't on our radar here in the United States?
So I think a lot is on the radar in terms of the big picture. I think we all understand that, Europe as a concept is under tremendous pressure internally and externally. And the externals are both Russia, certainly China, because China is aligned with Russia. By the way, the government of Finland just came out and said that they will veto any trade agreement between the EU and China as long as China is supporting Russia. So, so I think we understand clearly the threat to Europe from Russia, from China, from Iran. I think what is not really fully appreciated is the extent of their dependence on their own national security. Up until 2022, Europe lived in a world where they really believed that they were beyond history, that there would never be war again, that the very definition of the term Europe meant post-war. The European project came after World War II. There was a Cold War, of course. They were protected by America, but their very self-conception was that they're above the rules, that, it's funny countries like Israel that are so tribal and out there, bloodletting day and night. That's sort of the way they looked at other countries. Now they're in it. Now their doors are broken down. Now their windows are smashed, and the wind is coming in from every direction. And that is a wind of history. So they're living in it now. So the question is, what are they doing about it? They're looking at the United States, but then the relationship with Trump is very different from the relationship with Biden. They see every election in America as regime change in America, not in Iran. And they're very, very concerned about it. And now, you're seeing in the news just this week that the Americans are saying that they're missing munitions, so they're not going to comply with actual contracts with countries like the Baltics that, built their whole system around, the American, equipment that is coming in that may or may not come now. So there's a lot of uncertainty about, their external support. So I think the number one story that is missing is the value of Israeli tech. And I know, many of us are focused on Israel because we support, Israel, and we're excited about the startup nation. But there are only two countries in the world today that have taken apart Russian systems, Chinese systems, excuse me, like butter. Um, so far advanced in terms of technology and defense tech in a world that is moving so fast. And yes, Ukraine is doing a lot on counter drone technology and all that. We've checked that story. But I think a story that is missing and is a huge opportunity for investors is everyone is focused on how isolated Israel is and how Israel is not liked and not wanted. But at the same time, 12 billion more or less to Germany in the last 2, 3 years. Most of that is the Arrow 3 missile defense systems, but other systems that, autonomous submarines that are, sold to Germany. The tremendous business that is being done. I mean, what is it? Rafael, which is probably the weakest of the three big, defense contractors in Israel, Elbit, IAI, and Rafael. Just Rafael has 24 billion in back, deals that, is in the pipeline. I mean, it is tremendous. And it's probably just the beginning. And it may be a trend. I mean, we may be in defense tech for a few years, maybe not a full decade, but that trend is very strong. And I think it's underappreciated.
Yeah. No, we have a bunch of questions here on China. Actually, we have three questions on China, some on Russia, Ukraine, but someone did ask a question about AI and tech. And since you brought it up, I wanted to follow up with you. We at Omnia, you know, we have an allocation in VC, a small allocation in VC, and work closely with Joe Lonsdale at 8VC, who's done an amazing job, and Square One Labs, who's incubating deep tech. The guys, Amir and Jonathan, have done an amazing job. Now, I guess it's a two-part question. I mean, it partially relates to our strategic competition with China because, they are a power. They are pushing us in a lot of different directions. But I think one of the advantages we have in the West is we still innovate. They like to steal of the innovation, but we still innovate. We innovate in the United States, innovate in Israel. So I guess my first question is there like a tech ecosystem that is being incubated in Europe, similar to what we see in Israel and the United States? That's number one. And number two, and you sort of alluded to this, certainly Europe would be a good market for Israeli tech or American tech. I mean, we see just what's happening in Ukraine with the drones, AI. Everyone needs data centers. Everyone's freaking out about the lack of energy to the data centers for us to beat China. So I know it's a three-part, very broad question, but thought maybe you'd want to opine on that.
Yeah. So great question, and many parts to it. So first of all, the Europeans do have pockets of R&D. I mean, we all know the origins of AI didn't only start in the United States. The UK had a big, role in this in DeepMinds, and they do have a very serious AI innovation ecosystem there. Germany now is, again, is waking up. The reports that we have is that Germany, it's not multi-year, but they're going to put 1 trillion euro into their own defense and infrastructure. The Germans are much more favorable to US tech. They're certainly more favorable to Israeli tech. ELNET, as an organization, we felt it on our own skin. I mean, we were the ones that brought in the Bundestag's Defense Committee, so the equivalent of the US Armed Services Committee. That was a committee that voted on purchasing the Arrow 3 from Israel, and that's $8 billion deal, $8 billion deal, which is the largest in Israel's history defense deal. Much of the proceeds of that arrangement came back to Israel over the last 2.5 years, so that the revenue went into Israel's ability to defend itself, manufacture more munitions, and tremendous exchange. So Germany is moving fast, but they're large, they're bureaucratic. They're very much, like the Pentagon was, looking at 5 to 10 year, platforms. not really engaged in intensive R&D. And in the age that we're in now, which is quantum AI, drones that are, fiber optic, wherever it's going. And by the way, drones will reach the United States very soon, from other parts of the world. Zelensky is warning, a 10,000 mile, jet engine drone and so on. Israel's dealing with Hezbollah in Lebanon now. Traditionally it was an 8 kilometer to 10 kilometer, area where you would keep the anti-tank missiles away, but that's sort of, old fashioned now because what Hezbollah could have and is rearming to do is much, much greater distances, and with technologies that are very difficult to counter. So, we're looking at all that. So I guess to your question, yes, the countries that conduct R&D on a very high level and are not just focused on buying platforms are the countries that are going to win. And it's Israel, the United States, and some pockets in Europe, certainly Ukraine, but Ukraine has its own, mess on its hands with a Russia that is, again, the headlines may be everything rah rah Ukraine technology, but I understand that on the battlefield it's much more iffy than that, and the Russians are pushing forward and they're not relenting. So that's a big one for them. But I think the future is very much focused on the triangle of Ukraine, Israel, and the United States, because the battleground technologies are going to be born 3 times a week, and they're going to be upgraded in the software in the heat of battle. So a company like Extend that we engage in Israel, which is now more famous, and they're down in Florida. They're going to, they're going for an IPO, which is 1.5 trillion. But we started engaging Extend 4 years ago and introducing them to Europe, and they're opening plants in Europe. And Extend is, the IDF is looking at Extend as a future platform for themselves. So the R&D is getting more and more intensive and accelerated. One thing about China obviously is a big player here. They're not, frankly, they're probably not that concerned about the Strait. They have enough of their own reserves, and they're transitioning in energy. Everybody, is following that. But I think they are terrified by Trump.
Yeah.
And I think they're worried about the upcoming summit and what it will look like and feel like, and how the Americans are just completely unpredictable, which is also leverage. So I think the United States is mainly focused on China as a rival. Everything else is small. Iran going nuclear wouldn't be small, but right now it's being set back. So in a way, everything that we're focused on obsessively in the Strait and all the calculations about storage and the future of energy markets is small change for the United States. The big challenge remains China and the technological race, and that's where I think it's worth investors, focusing at least some of their resources.
Yeah, I want to follow up because we have two questions in the chat on China. And it's look, I've had a lot of experience, as you know, working in DC with the government, both Democrat and Republican administrations. It would not be it would be fair to say that we are in one of the most polarized political environments that I've certainly visited, witnessed, where, the joke that I make is, in DC, Democrats and Republicans can't even agree what the name of the Rayburn cafeteria should be, right? Like they just don't agree on anything. But the one thing, even if that they do agree on, though they may not agree on the strategies on how to confront it, I think both parties do agree on the ongoing threat from China, which is really, really important. And I'm curious what Europe, I mean, again, we don't paint Europe with the one brush, but maybe if you could highlight a few of the countries, what their feeling is to China, with the strategic competition, and maybe some conversations you're having on the ground with them, if you feel free to share with us that, urging them to some of these countries that we got to stay in the Western orbit. This alliance needs to get stronger, not move over to China, because that'll be a red line, certainly for the Trump administration. And I'll also mention, just quickly follow up to what you just said about tech. I mean, we're having Israel Tech Week actually in Miami next week. You're joining us, David. And one of the big siloed subsections of this is defense tech. Amazing groups like Stratos Ventures and others that are coming. And one of the things that is an unfortunate reality of, well, it's a fortunate reality that we're at war, but we're seeing is the amazing technology that's being played on the battlefield and people understanding that these technologies very well may have commercial use, right? If you're able to
Of course.
operate a device in another country not plugged into the grid and having enough power for 10 years, wow, wouldn't that be amazing if we could use that technology for powering certain systems here in the United States or in Europe?
Um, so I was waiting for your question. So
So no, well, I did a tangent after my original question,
yeah,
but what does Europe's thing to say about China, and what
yeah.
conversations are you having with leaders, if you are telling them and encouraging them, or what would you tell them to encourage them? You know what? I understand that the Chinese pay a lot for a little. I understand, I understand they do things cheaper at times because they undercut the markets. We know, like we talk about this all the time. When it comes to high-powered magnets, they are pricing the magnets below the price of the raw materials, right? And thank God we have MP materials, in Nevada and California and Dallas Fort Worth that are getting some of that supply chain back. But it's very important for the security of the United States and the Western alliance that we don't get bought out by the Chinese and we don't allow them to encroach and we don't allow them to control our key supply chains. And obviously, it's a problem that the Europeans are dealing with as well.
Right. So a few things again about Europe. I mean, what I think we should all be worried about is that the relationship is off the rails. I mean, Europe and the United States right now, under current conditions, over the last 2 years, everything from tariffs to Greenland to, not count, or they feel not counted, not consulted, invisible. Then you have the fight with the Pope and, everything that's going on, that even Maloney is, screaming and yelling at Trump and vice versa. And everybody's doing it for their own political purposes and so on. But the end result is that, there are a lot of emotions and not enough strategy and not enough strategic thinking. I mean, strategically, of course, China is a major threat to Europe, just like it is in the United States. But there's also, again, we talked about this before, you're looking at a deck of cards in Europe. Those countries closer to the border with Russia are existentially threatened by Russia, and therefore they will be more hostile towards the Irans and the Chinas in terms of their relationship with Russia. But as you move away from the border, deeper into the continent, yeah, it's there, it's intellectual, but they also have trade, interests. They're angry at the Americans, they want to cut a deal with the Chinese. It takes a country like Finland, which is not Eastern Europe, it's Northern Europe, but they're on the border with Russia and they're saying, stop, we're not going to let you because, out of the 27 countries in Europe, everyone has to agree on any big move like a trade deal with China. And all you need is one to veto it and it's over. So when the Finns say, and that was today, we're not going to allow that because of Chinese hostility to the European project through their support of Russia, versus Ukraine, then it shows you that there are countries that are very, very aware of this. But I think the main concern is that the continued fight between Europe and the United States is going to affect everything, including, strategic self-interest.
Two final questions. One that was texted to me. Actually, there are a couple that are texted me on the same issue, and then I have one final question for you, David. And again, I appreciate your time. I appreciate everything you do, and so glad we're having this conversation. But the conversation is on Russia and Ukraine. The question asks, like, when is this going to end? Or how does this end? Like what does success look like for Europe? What do you think success looks like from the United States? And what do you think Russia would be willing to make a deal for?
Well, I think in many ways Russia is analogous to Iran. The war that we're in right now on both fronts is not a new war, and it's not going to end with an agreement or with, the markets may celebrate, but I think, as real eye, looking at the situation with cold eyes, Russia is there to stay. Russia is a long-term threat to more than just Ukraine. The Baltics certainly feel that existential winds coming toward them, and they have big questions about whether the United States and the rest of Europe will be there to comply with Article 5 or whatever article in the EU. to protect them. So they're going to be in a race to, build as much as they can to protect themselves. Same in Poland, but again, you don't see them going all the way. You see them going to 2%, 3%. Poland is close to 5% of GDP in terms of the NATO requirements and the U.S. expectations. But they're not instituting full, military draft. It's, so there's a lot of politics, noise, behind the scenes. But overall, Russia is going to remain a threat to Europe, and that will animate their national security concept. The German intelligence is talking about, the Russians are coming. So are other, intelligence agencies in Europe, and that is serious, and some of that is even classified, so it's not in the public, as you probably know. So they're not just playing it for, for political reasons, but it's an ongoing threat. Now, the Russia, U.S., Ukraine dynamic is not really including Europe as decision makers, which is also part of their animus here, vis-a-vis this current White House. They're not in the room. They're not in the room on Iran. They're not in the room on Ukraine. So what does success look like to Europe? Probably irrelevant. Question is, what is success in the eyes of Trump and this White House? And that, remains to be seen. There's so many moving parts here with all of these conflicts from China to Iran to Russia that it's hard to say. But I think, Trump is going to be animated by, his own narrative of success on all three fronts, not by the midterms, not by domestic American politics, not by gas prices, not by public opinion polls, certainly not people that don't vote for him anyway, not by his popularity levels. It just doesn't, as far as the people I talk to who, are looking at this very closely, and they could also be wrong, it's just not what animates where he wants to go. He wants a win, whatever that definition is in his own eyes, and that, remains to be seen on all three fronts.
Right. So one final question, and it's a question, David, that I ask you every morning. So it is not a new question to
By
you.
the way, we ask each other lots of questions,
We
especially
do.
in ongoing wars. So thank you, Lawrence. Yes.
No, it's my pleasure. But it's a question I ask you all the time. And, as you said, it's the Middle East, not the Midwest, right? Things change very rapidly, and every day the answer sometimes changes. But, for us at Omni, and I know for you and your incredible team at ELNET, you don't want to always react to headlines. You want to really understand the macro forces that are materializing around the globe and help make strategic decisions, not to speculate on what might happen or take action based on a tweet or a soundbite. How do you see this war with Iran ending? I referenced it a little bit at the beginning of our conversation, the discrepancy between the Iranians only have, I remember seeing originally, it was 10 to 14 days of storage capacity for oil. Then it went to 3 to 4 weeks, and they would have to turn these offline. Now they're saying 3 to 4 months. So how long can they hold out? And again, how long can the Europeans stay out of it, right? If the Strait of Hormuz continue to be an issue, what do you think the United States will accept as yes? And I guess put your diplomat as a consul general for the state of Israel's hat on. What do you think the Iranians will take as a yes?
So let's start with Iran. The fact that their leadership was decapitated does matter. Everyone is playing down this, playing down that. People that don't like Trump will tell you that the war is failing, but the facts are facts. Iran was hit very hard. They don't have an organized decision-making process right now. The supreme leader is gone. His son is probably alive, wounded, clearly, but that's not even the issue. Once the cover on the pot is off, the pot is going to continue boiling. And no one really knows who has the upper hand and what exactly does it mean in terms of their decision making moving forward. So obviously the IRGC is significant. Obviously the foreign minister is not. Obviously the speaker of the parliament who comes out of the IRGC is probably playing both camps as well as he can. He does want some sort of deal. He is connected to the West. He does speak English. And he's articulate actually. So he is part of, the modern world, not just the closed IRGC bubble, but he also comes out of the most deadly units in the IRGC. So what does all this mean in the end of the day? And when President Trump said in a tweet, I think yesterday, I don't know who rules Iran. It's sort of funny, but it's real. I don't think the best intelligence agencies can tell you right now who exactly, and part of it is the status that we see. We just don't see movement in terms of the Iranian decision making. Now, the question is, what will move them? Absolute destruction of all their desalination plants, energy plants. It could come to that. It could come to that, and I think one of the working assumptions, at least in the Israeli intelligence community, is that that may happen if things don't move. But there's a lot of time here because if Trump isn't in a hurry, which we just said he may or may not be, he may or may not be focused on the midterms. I mean, he's not going to be reelected. That may not be what concerns him. So, he's not in a hurry. If the Iranians don't have a decision-making system that can actually make decisions right now, then by definition, they're not in a hurry. They're distinct from the people of Iran. So it doesn't matter how much pressure you put on their infrastructure and systems. At some point, there's a breaking point. We just can't really pinpoint it. So we said very early on that this war will probably continue to a range of between June and September, just for our own planning purposes. And that's after discussing it with the Israeli intelligence community and national security community. We now think that may be optimistic.
Wow. Wow.
It could very well be that we'll be in this for a very long time to come with ups and downs and markets up, markets down. But in the end, it's all tactical because America is a superpower and America is not really focused on the Strait of Hormuz. America doesn't need the energy supplies there. And if Bangladesh falls, which is the big concern of the IMF right now, does this White House really care? If the Europeans suffer economically, does this White House really care? This White House is focused on technology, AI, quantum, China threat, internal polarization, whatever the stories are in America. Those are the list of concerns. Had Iran gone nuclear, Iran would be way up there. But right now it's not. It's defanged, for all intents and purposes for the near to medium term. So, who's in a hurry here?
Right.
And I think as investors, again, put aside all the tweets and all the X's and all the drama about, oh my God, 14 more days and the world's reserves are over. China has 1 billion, barrels. America only has 400 billion and needs 200 billion, a million for its own reserves and so on. That's the red line. A lot of that is noise. The facts are that the prices haven't moved that dramatically, much less in other crises that we discussed before. The White House is apparently not in a hurry unless something changes again. This is an assessment for here and now, not for next month, not for five months from now. And I think the biggest takeaway from this whole conversation for investors is we are in a world of extreme uncertainty on everything. What will the Middle East look like? What will Israel be? There may be, there's going to be elections in Israel in, I guess, late October. And whoever wins, well, what's going to change? Do you really think that, Bennett or Eisenkot are going to turn to the woke left? Their fight with Iran is not going to change. The threat of Hezbollah is not going to change. The problem of Gaza is not going to change. The government will change. It may sound better. It may engage more robustly. That's not going to change. But everything else around us is changing. So as investors, I would be really careful not to follow headlines.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I want to end with I'm going to take the liberty to make a statement, David, and then I'm going to give you the final word. First of all, thank you so much again for your time. I mean, I love having these conversations. I learned so much from you. I hope you know that, and I
Mutual.
appreciate your time. And look, as people on this call know, I mean, I've dealt with government officials, of heads of state, for many, many years, and a lot of them are smart. Some are not, but a lot of them are smart. Not as smart as you, but they're intelligent. But the one thing that you have, your special sauce, is number one, you're always available. You always answer your phone and you give the best advice. And I'm just so grateful for it. And my mentors taught me, the best way to evaluate who you want to work with, who you want to do business with, is you like the person, you trust the person, and you think they're smart. And you hit all those qualities, David. And there's a reason why ELNET is such a successful organization. So thank you. I'll tell you, when I have these conversations, I always like to end. I always like to think of what are the main points that I get out of this, and I'm going to list these main points. You don't have to respond to it. I'm going to give you the last word after, but one of the main points that I take from this is, contrary to many people's beliefs, Europe does matter. Europe is not dead. Europe is not, we should not ignore Europe. We need to embrace it. We need to understand it. And we need to do the important work on the ground, or that ELNET's doing, to forge a stronger transatlantic alliance, and certainly alliance between Europe and Israel. So that's one main point. Second main point, which has become clear to me over the years, but I think we stamped home here, is that ELNET is the organization on the front lines making that happen. And we're so grateful for you. You're not only doing this on behalf of your organization, but you're doing it on behalf of the United States, Western civilization, and our markets. Number three, you pointed out many times that technology is our future. I mean, we talked about AI, technology, quantum, and one of the things we have, despite our confrontation or our strategic competition with China, we have innovators. We have like Jenna Rodiers, who I think is on the call, engineer, who's innovating technology. We have innovation in Israel, innovation in the United States, innovation in Europe. We need to not only innovate, but work together to scale that innovation. We need to make sure that we not only onshore key supply chains, but ally shore key supply chains. Not everything needs to be in the United States, but it needs to be in friendly countries. And most importantly, what I've learned is that the relationships that I have personally with you, David, and that Omnia has with you and with ELNET, the amazing organization, is we're just so grateful for it, and we really appreciate your time and being here with us. And I hope this is the first of multiple online conversations. I'm still going to call you every day at 7 a.m. for advice, but I hope this is the first of an ongoing series. So I'm going to give you the
Well,
last word before we wrap up.
thank you. In the minute that we have, thank you very much, everyone, for being on this call today. It's a great honor for me and Lawrence. We have a great friendship, and I learn a lot from you. It's very mutual. And I have to tell you, when Lawrence was on the ground in Israel last year during the first round with Iran, it was tremendously value to hear your assessment, and you were always right on the dot. So it's very mutual. And I just want to say, follow us, be part of what we're doing. We're the only organization really, working in a part of the world that we believe is very important to everyone's future. We don't just, walk away from Europe. It doesn't make any sense. We need to work Europe. It's not always easy. There are countries that are very hostile right now, but there are going to be elections in Spain next year. Not that Spain is that important. There are going to be elections in France next year. That could be a revolution in continental politics there. Never without strings and complications, but it's a place where we need to be in and be there professionally, without emotions, focusing on long-term alliances and the value that they bring to all of us. So thank you again, Lawrence, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And follow David at elnetus.org, or just reach out to me directly and I could put you all in touch. And we recorded this and we're sending it out, so feel free to send it to others. So we finished 30 seconds above time, which is a world record for
My
me
fault.
during these webinars. So thank you everyone for being here, and we look forward to seeing you soon. We have a bunch of upcoming speakers that we'll be announcing in the days ahead. So look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.